All right. Hi, everybody. So in this video, I'm going to talk about populism. I'm going to talk about the populist movement, the populist party with a capital P. They'll explain more about that in a second, uh, of the late 19th century. I'm going to talk about populism more generally, and when I talk about populism more generally, that's populism with a lowercase p, as I'll talk about. So yeah, here's the focus question. If you want to write this down, what were the origins and the significance of populism? So again, what were the origins and significance of populism? Populism with a capital P. Okay, so let's get into kind of the different kinds of populism. So notice I said populism and populism. The first populism has a capital P. The second populism, second use of the word populism has a lowercase p. So what's up with that? So again, so there was a movement of populists that eventually in the 1890s coalesced into, as we'll talk more about, coalesced into the Populist Party, also known as the People's Party, which was a Western agrarian reform movement. So a movement mostly, not exclusively, but mostly made up of southern and western small and kind of medium-sized farmers that were having a rough time in the late 19th century. So they put their heads together and they started this populist movement. So when you see populism with a capital P or the Populist Party with a capital P, that's what that's referring to, is the populists, the Western agrarians of the protest movement of the late 19th century. Now, that specific movement, that political party that we're going to talk about, fits within this broader tradition of populism with a lowercase p. And that's where I wanted to kind of start today, is by talking about populism kind of more generally, populism with a lowercase p. And there's different reasons why, a few different reasons, related reasons why I want to spend a little bit of time on this. So first of all, populism is definitely relevant. It has contemporary relevance, right? So a lot has been made in the last, 10 years or so, maybe going back even before that, about populist movements, and in particular right-wing, conservative populism, the upsurge in conservative populism, and you could see iterations of that in Marine Le Pen in France, in Brexit, which happened a few years ago. The victory for the Brexit movement, and the Great Britain leaving the European Union. That was seen as that was sort of a dream of conservative populists, like within that context. And then, of course, Trump and Trumpism, right? The Trump phenomenon. That's considered by many to be another example of right-wing populism. And of course, all the examples I just gave were, right-wing conservative populism. There's also left-wing populism, right? So if you think about the campaign, 2016 presidential campaign or the campaign for the fight for the Democratic presidential nomination between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. So in that case, Hillary Clinton represented the establishment. Undoubtedly, Bernie Sanders represented this sort of grassroots, left-leaning, populist coalition, and he came, close, a lot closer than people were anticipating, to winning the nomination in 2016. I think he got even closer in 2020 to winning the Democratic presidential nomination. So, and that was a left-leaning populism. And that kind of gets at something that's interesting about populism. It's very malleable, right? I think has certain characteristics, but it's more flexible than a lot of other worldviews and ideologies. And usually it comes in combination with other ideologies, other worldviews. So that's why, immediately when I started talking about this, I said, well, there's conservative populism and there's kind of liberal, left-leaning populism, right? And you could probably even break populism up into more distinct, more fine-tuned categories as well. But yeah, that's kind of the first reason I wanted to talk about populism. It's relevant. It has a lot of contemporary relevance, right? Um, the second reason is that this relates to your final essay. So I'm not sure if you looked at the final essay assignment sheet. I'm not going to spend too much time on this right now, but just wanted to mention. So essentially, I'm having you deal with the conservative resurgence of the late 20th century in the United States. Um, and to do that, you're going to read, or a part of doing that is reading this book, Suburban Warriors by Lisa McGurr. Really fantastic book. I think you'll enjoy it. And then basically you have to pick one of two different essay prompts. One of the essay prompts is stays a little more firmly within the context of the conservative resurgence of the 1970s, right? And gets into what are the reasons for this conservative resurgence, what are the different factors, how does McGurr's kitchen table activists fit into this. But the other prompt, if you take a look at this, the other prompt deals with populism, right? Because in McGurr's book, she's exploring a specific group of conservative populist activists in the late 20th century, and kind of what motivated them and what impact they had on democratic politics. And what I'm getting at in the second prompt is thinking about what I'm having you do if you choose to, use this to write an essay on the second prompt dealing with populism, is to think about the continuities and changes, think about the similarities and differences between the populists in McGurr's book of the late 20th century, mid to late 20th century conservative populists, and the populists of like the late 19th century and populists in other aspects of American history. So that's why I wanted to talk about populism kind of more generally, and wanted to spend kind of a disproportionate amount of time on the populace with a capital P. And that's what I'm going to do right now. Okay, so populism with a lowercase p, what does that refer to? So, basically, I think scholars generally agree, and I think this makes kind of intuitive sense to most people. Scholars generally agree that populism includes some kind of appeal to the people, right, and a denunciation of the elite. So accordingly, populism isn't an overtly contentious, I'm sorry. It shouldn't be, controversial to say that populism essentially always involves a populist appeal, a populist movement, whatever the country it's coming out of, whether it's a right wing or left wing iteration of populism. All populist movements, to be, legitimately defined, credibly defined as populist movements, involve some kind of critique of the establishment and an adulation, celebration, praise of the common people, right? But of course, who's the establishment, who's the elite, and who's the common people? That's the devil's in the details there, right? So we'll get into more about that. So I think a good definition of populism, and I'll kind of break this down a little bit more after I give just the one sentence definition here. I would define populism basically as a thin-centered ideology or worldview that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogenous and antagonistic camps: the pure people on one side, one camp, versus the corrupt elite on the other side, and which also argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people, should represent the general will of the people. So I mentioned the phrase thin-centered ideology. Thin-centered ideology. What does that mean? I think it's a little jargony, but makes sense if you think about it. So an ideology is basically a worldview, right? It's a body of normative ideas about the nature of man and society, as well as the organization of society and the purposes of society and the purposes of government, and what problems, if any, is government supposed to solve, right? How should government be structured? How should society be structured? That kind of thing. That's what we're talking about when we talk about ideology. So you have what I would call like full or thick-centered ideologies, which are basically more specific, more precise, and less malleable, less changeable. I would put ideologies like liberalism, socialism, communism, fascism, even in those categories. There's lots of different iterations of, for example, socialism. But it's a little more specific, and it's less flexible than something like populism is, right? Um, so unlike these full or thick-centered ideologies, thin-centered ideologies like populism, I would say, have, it basically, they're less specific, and they come usually attached with or attached to, assimilated into other ideologies like socialism. So left-leaning populism a lot of times has sort of kind of socialist overtones, or maybe even more than overtones to it, right? So basically, populism must be understood as a kind of mental map through which individuals analyze and comprehend political reality. It is not so much a coherent ideological tradition as it is a set of ideas. And these ideas in the real world usually appear in combination with different and sometimes contradictory ideologies. So I think basically concepts are only useful. I would say, I would argue, concepts are only useful if they not only include what is to be defined, but also exclude. I also make it clear about what things don't fit into that context. I kind of bungled that. Let me say that a little bit differently. So I think a definition is only useful. It's a better way to say this. A definition is only useful, right? If it's clear what fits into the definition and what doesn't fit into the definition, right? And you can make arguments sort of, there could be disagreements on the margins, but if it's just total confusion about what fits into the definition and what doesn't fit in with the definition, then the definition isn't doing a whole lot, right? So, I think we should be able to say, what populism is, we should be able to say what populism definitely is not, right? So how do we define non-populism? What are some non-populist worldviews? So really the two direct opposites of populism, I would say, are elitism and pluralism, right? So starting with elitism. So elitism shares populism's basic Manichaean distinctions of society between a homogeneous good and a homogeneous evil. So it's similar to populism in that sense, but it holds an opposite view on the virtues of those groups. So basically, elitists believe that the people are dangerous, the people are dishonest, vulgar, and the elite are superior not only in moral, but also in cultural and in intellectual terms. So, hence, elitists want politics to be exclusively or predominantly an elite affair in which the people do not have a say. And elitists would either reject democracy altogether, or in some cases, support a limited model of democracy. An example from early American history of elitism, I would say, is because, in more modern American history and certainly in contemporary American society, I think there are certainly people and movements that hold an elitist point of view, but they usually don't say it out loud. And that shows you sort of the power of populism in contemporary politics and contemporary society. But you could go back to the founding of the United States and the first couple of decades of the formation of the first party system in the United States. And you had the Jeffersonians, or also known as the Democratic Republicans, on one side, representing a more egalitarian democracy. But then on the other side, you had the Federalists, or the Federalist Party, who represented a more elitist view. It wasn't anti-democracy necessarily, but it was anti-egalitarian democracy. And it was a more elitist view of politics, right? So the party was led by moneyed men, so men of social standing in the community, men of means and of property, who felt that saw themselves as sort of an enlightened leadership, right? They didn't want the franchise to be extended to all people. They wanted people with certain property qualifications to be put on suffrage, on the right to vote. So that's not anti-democratic in the sense of being totally against voting and totally against, the rule of law and other aspects of democratic society. But it's an elite view of politics, undoubtedly. The opposite another kind of opposite worldview, formulation of politics opposing populism would be pluralism, right? So pluralism, I would say, is the direct opposite of this dualistic perspective of both populism and elitism. And instead of holding the society is divided into into a broad variety of let me back up. So pluralism instead holds that society should be divided into a broad variety of partly overlapping social groups with different ideas and interests. So within pluralism, diversity is seen as a strength rather than a weakness. And in this case, we're talking about diversity of interest, different interest groups. So pluralists believe that a society should have many centers of power, and that politics, through compromise and consensus, should reflect the interests and values of as many different groups as possible. Thus, the main objective for pluralists is that power should be distributed throughout society in order to avoid specific groups, be they men or specific ethnic communities, or economic or intellectual or military groups, or narrowly defined interests. The idea is to stop one group from acquiring a disproportionate amount of power over everyone else, such that they can impose their will over everyone else. That's not populism. That's also not elitism, but that's definitely not populism. Okay, so what else can we kind of say about populism? Well, populists appeal to, quote, the people, but what do we mean by that? What do populists mean by that? Quote, the people, right? So the notion of the people as sovereign is based on the modern democratic idea that defines the people, quote unquote, not only as the ultimate source of political power, but also as the rulers. And when I say like the people are sovereign or the people have sovereignty, that's what that means. Sovereignty means in control, in charge, power, right? That's a modern idea that came about that's part and parcel with liberal democratic ideas, right? Actually, let me talk more about that right now. So this notion of the people as sovereign, which is inherent in populist appeals, is closely linked to the American and French revolutions, which in the famous words of President Abraham Lincoln established, quote, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, end quote. However, the formation of a democratic regime does not imply that the gap between governed and governors disappears completely. Under certain circumstances, the sovereign people can feel that they are not being well represented by the elites in power. And accordingly, they will criticize or even revolt against the political establishment. This could set the stage for a populist struggle to give the government back to the people. And in almost all cases, that's the origin story of populist movements, from Trump to the populists of the 19th century, to Brexit, to name your, populist movement. In other words, the notion of the people as sovereign, the people in control, is a common topic within different populist traditions, which functions as a reminder of the fact that the ultimate source of political power in a democracy derives from a collective body, which, if not taken into account, may lead to mobilization, revolt. And this is, of course, one of the driving forces, as we'll talk about, behind the Populist Party of the late 19th century and the populist movement more generally of that time. So a second meaning behind the people, quote unquote, refers explicitly, or at least implicitly, to a broader class concept. So this formulation of the people doesn't have as much to do with democracy and the people being sovereign, but it has more to do with, within the context of populist movements and populist appeals, it has more to do with class divisions and sort of class conflict and class hatred in a lot of cases, right? So it refers to a broader class concept that combines socioeconomic status with specific cultural traditions and popular values. Speaking of, quote, the common people in populist appeals, right, often refers to a critique of the dominant culture, which views the judgment, tastes, and values of ordinary citizens with suspicion. In contrast to this elitist view, the notion of the common people vindicates the dignity and knowledge of groups who objectively or subjectively, excuse me, are being excluded from power due to their sociocultural or socioeconomic status. This is the reason why populist leaders and constituencies often adopt cultural elements that are considered markers of inferiority by the dominant group, by the dominant culture. And importantly, the dominant group is seen as a minority. So the dominant group of, quote, elitists are seen as a minority that have unfairly impose their values, their will, their mode of governance, their beliefs on everyone else. That's part and parcel with a populist appeal. I think you see that in almost all populist appeals. And if you don't see elements of that, probably the movement that you're talking about isn't really a populist movement. So when we talk about populism with a lowercase p, that's really what we're talking about, I think. So, excuse me. Let's see. What else do I want to mention here? Okay, so let me get to differing interpretations of populism. And here I'm going to get into some historiography. And let me talk about what historiography is for people that don't know. So in other academic disciplines, they would talk about this as like literature review. In history, we call this historiography. And historiography basically refers to the history of history. The history of history. And what that means, if you think about it, is let me back up a little bit. So history is constructed, right? History is what happened. How do you interpret a certain era? What characterized a certain era of American history? What happened in a certain movement? How do we make sense of a certain movement, a certain event in, for example, American history? That's contested over time by historians, right, who write books and articles and argue with each other. And over time, a consensus is formed. Sometimes there's an overwhelming consensus that seems totally unshakable and unchangeable. But sure enough, 20 years later, dissenting views trickle out and they convince enough people, and sure enough, the consensus view, what seemed like a consensus view, has become an opposing, totally different conception that becomes a new consensus view. Or maybe new works come out that call into question what used to be a consensus view, and you could take a certain snapshot of the historiography and credibly say, like, this is contested. Historians don't agree on this. Some historians say this, others say that. You decide for yourself. When we talk about historiography, that's kind of what we're talking about. I don't spend too much time in historiography, the history of historical interpretations and how interpretations have changed over time. I don't spend too much time in that in this class. That's a more advanced historical skill, but I do want to talk about that a little bit. I think it's especially interesting when it comes to the populist movement of the late 19th century. And also it really drives home the idea that, again, history isn't a thing that was discovered by, so like the populist movement wasn't a movement that was discovered by the first generation of historians, let's say in 1920, after the populist movement had ended. And they decided this is what we think about the populist movement, and then it's been the same for 100 years after that. And that's not how this works, right? So I think that me spending time in this kind of drives home that point. Okay, so let's talk about different interpretations of the populist movement. So newer works on the populists of the late 19th century have typically situated their interpretations in response to a classic book by historian Richard Hofstadter, very famous historian, titled The Age of Reform, From Bryan to FDR. Again, the book is called The Age of Reform, From Bryan to FDR. And in this book, basically, Hofstadter contrasts the reform efforts of the populist progressives and New Dealers, which I'm just going to talk about his views on the populists here. So Hofstadter envisioned his work as a necessary corrective to previous histories of this, quote, age of reform that tended to emphasize the genuinely monumental achievements of the populists, while mostly ignoring their more negative elements, their more kind of reactionary, conspiratorial, and we could say quixotic aspects of the populists. So Hofstadter himself is responding to certain trends in the writing, the interpretations of history that came before him, right? Specifically, he argued in this book, he argues that the populists embodied two distinct impulses with reform-oriented agrarian businessmen representing one impulse, basically, who called for more fully integrating Western farmers into American economic growth and pushing the hard side of populism. So that's kind of one strain of populism that Hofstadter claims was relevant. But he claims there was another side of populism, which was the soft side of populism. And so The soft side of populism, the soft siders, were animated by resentment stemming from their conception of themselves as victims of capitalist modernity. Hofstadter maintained that populism's soft side was steeped in nostalgia for basically a pastoral, pre-modern, and pre-capitalist American past that was totally made up, that only really existed in their imagination, right? Um, they viewed modernity and progress as really a conspiracy, according to Hofstadter, propagated by vaguely defined yet unquestionably bad, malevolent interests against them, the people, the good people, defined as upstanding Western farmers like themselves. And Hofstadter furthermore argued that the anti-modern strain of populism became dominant over the more business-oriented reform, practical, reform-oriented strain. So this more kind of extreme, certainly from our modern day vantage point, negative, conspiratorial, and anti-modern strain of populism became dominant in the 1890s, according to Hofstadter, eliciting a mode of politics defined by anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, moral absolutism, and racism, anti-Black prejudice. So this view is not the view shared by most historians nowadays, though. So I would say in the last 20 years or so, there's been a reinterpretation of the populist movement, and kind of the leading reinterpretation is a book called The Populist Vision by Charles Postel, which I'll talk about right now. So here, Postel directly challenges not only Hofstadter's interpretation of late 19th century populists, negative portrayal of these late 19th century populists, but also refutes more positive portrayals of the populists, like the book Democratic Promise by Lawrence Goodwin, for example, which extolled the democratizing virtues of the populists' alleged crusade against modernity and creative progress. So, and this is kind of the main thrust of Postel's interpretation. So in the populist vision, Postel argues that the populists, rather than being sort of Don Quixotes, tilting at the windmills of modernity and commercial change, that's a great quote from the book. Postel posits that, quote, the men and women of the populist movement were modern people, end quote. Populists were actually modern. Hofstadter's and even Goodwin's confusion, according to Postel, stems from focusing disproportionately on what populists were against, like ruthless corporations and trusts, the financial establishment's tight money, gold bug policies, which these populists blame for example, spiraling debt and unemployment in the late 19th century. So again, Postel is saying that interpretations like Hofstadter focus disproportionately on what populists were against, as opposed to what they were actually for, what they favored, their solutions, their suggested solutions to these problems. And he argues that because so many histories of the Gilded Age have linked the rise of American capitalism dominated by large corporations to the emergence of modern America, any criticisms of this new society have been assumed to come from a primitive, traditional, and decidedly anti-modern point of view, regardless of whether these critics proposed demolishing modernity or if they simply wish to reform it. So Postel believes that populists fuse progress with reform. So they wanted to reform capitalism and modernity. They weren't against capitalism. They weren't against the railroads, for example. They wanted the railroads to work for them. That's the idea. They fuse progress with reform by fighting to link Southern and Western farmers to the new dynamic society and thus create a more equitable and just modernity. Postel traces the populist coalition from its beginnings in the coalescence of millions of farmers into farmers' associations in the 1880s, and most prominently in the coalescence most prominently the Farmers Alliance, describing how these farmers went into politics, quote unquote, in the early 1890s in the hopes of leveraging their impressive organizational strength into political power, forming the short-lived populist or People's Party. Okay. One other interesting thing I was going to mention about him, and then talk more about the populists generally and kind of go from there. But one other interesting point that Postel points out, that Postel makes, is, so again, it fits in with this idea that populism the populists of the late 19th century were modern. And by the way, the link between populism and modernity, you could see that in the essay question, the final essay question. If you choose to answer that question, that's a link you can make, certainly in this context. Link between populism and modernity in the context of late 19th century populists. And I think you can also make that link in other iterations of populism, like the populists of the McGurr depicts of the late 20th century, conservative kitchen table activists and populists. But save that discussion for another day. Okay, so yeah, Postal is adamant, kind of in keeping with this idea that the populists were modern people, right? It was a modern movement. He's adamant that the populists believed in science, right? And as proven by their embrace of scientific innovations in agriculture. They embrace scientific innovations in agriculture. So, and kind of in keeping with this, Postal points out that, yes, racial prejudice was a part of the populist appeal in many cases, right? Racial prejudice was certainly present in the populist movement. But this actually proves his point more than negating his point, right? Populist persistent racism, which was drawn in many ways from the milieu of scientific racism that had reached a high point in the late 19th century, really furnishes further proof of populist allegiance to modernity. So, at least in this case, saying that populism was linked to anti-Black prejudice and racism, this is the high point of scientific racism. So modernity, science, racism are all linked together. That proves more than disproves that the populists were actually a modern movement. Okay, so let's talk more about kind of the details of the populists. Who were they? Where did they come from? What did they fight for? What were their policies? What were their sort of limitations, etc.? So yeah, let's start with the farmers' revolt. So yeah, like workers, farmers in the South and West faced growing economic insecurity as agricultural prices fell and economic dependency on merchants and banks increased in the late 19th century. Some of the problems were, first of all, sharecropping. So sharecropping kept millions of Black and white, actually, Southern farmers in poverty. Another problem was the oversupply of world cotton in the late 19th century, which led kind of inevitably to a dramatic price decrease, or dramatic price decreases that threatened Southern farmers' livelihoods and property. So these farmers, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, blame their woes, blame what ailed them in large part on railroads, and specifically they opposed railroads' high freight rates. They also opposed high interest rate loans from bankers and merchants, which they felt they had to rely upon. They felt that they were being gouged in terms of, taken advantage of in terms of interest rates. And many of these banks were connected to Eastern financial institutions and Eastern financiers. So that, certainly that was a part of the, that was an impetus for this movement was, it's one thing if they're being offered loans from a bank in Kansas, right, who kind of knows the local agricultural conditions of Kansas. It's another thing to having to rely upon financiers that, in New York City or Boston or Philadelphia, right? There's an inherent kind of regional bias that's sort of that's assumed to be baked into the cake there, if that makes sense. Okay. Let's see. They also opposed the fiscal policies of the federal government that reduced the money supply and farm prices. I'll talk more about that. In response, farmers organized, as I mentioned a second ago, the Farmers Alliance, starting in Texas in the late 1870s, which quickly spread to dozens of other states, mostly in the South and especially in the West. The alliance at first, the Farmers Alliance at first stayed away from politics. And basically established cooperatives called exchanges to finance and market crops. But when banks refused to loan money for these exchanges, the alliance proposed the sub-treasury plan. So when you think of so the populists had many different ideas that I'll talk about. the kind of linchpin of the populist platform was the sub-treasury plan, this idea of a sub-treasury plan. So the idea here is the federal government would establish warehouses where farmers could store their crops until sold, and by issuing crops as collateral, the government would issue loans directly to farmers at low interest rates, ending their dependence on bankers and merchants for credit. Demands for the sub-treasury ultimately led the populists into politics in the late 1880s and 1890s. So again, the idea with the sub-treasury plan was establish a system of warehouses where crops could be sold. They could use their crops as collateral for low interest loans that the government would guarantee, again at low interest rates, and small and medium sized farmers in the West and the South could bypass Eastern financial elites who they felt were gouging them, making their way of life untenable, unworkable. So in the early 1890s, the alliance formed the People's Party or Populist Party, the era's greatest political insurgency. The populists appealed not just to farmers, but to all, quote, producers, including miners, industrial workers, and small businessmen, or they at least tried to appeal to these groups with limited success, which I'll talk more about. But most of its supporters ultimately were cotton and wheat farmers in the South and West. The populists organized massive educational campaigns, making use of different mediums like pamphlets and newspapers, revival-style mass meetings throughout the country. This was I think you could see the populists as the last expression of the 19th century idea that America was a commonwealth of small producers whose freedom rested on individual ownership of productive property and the dignity of labor. And I think saying that is different than saying the populists were anti-modern, right? So again, scholars have called this idea into question. That the populists were anti-modern. So I think, that we can say that while at the same time saying that this was in many ways the last gasp of this idea, which has roots in the 19th century and even before. And we'll talk more about this in a second, but to kind of introduce this idea. So it's the idea that America was a nation of small producers and ought to continue to be a nation of small producers. And freedom was kind of rooted in this idea of a commonwealth of, individual ownership of productive property and the dignity of labor. And you essentially, you get to reap the fruits of your labor. If you produce more, then you should get a windfall from that. So, producerism, the labor theory of value, labor theory of property, that kind of thing. Okay. But the populists were at the same time, as I mentioned, modern. They were forward-looking, embracing scientific methods of agriculture and modern technologies that made large-scale cooperatives possible, like the railroads, the telegraph, and the national market. And they wanted the federal government to regulate them for the public interest, a very 20th century idea, actually. And a lot of their ideas came to influence the progressive movement, which came after them, and the New Deal movement, which came after that. So in some ways, the populists were like ahead of their time. And I would say another aspect of their appeal was promoting the public good, as opposed to they saw themselves as being above the fray of politics. Whether they actually were, I think, is an open question. I think in many ways they were not, but they saw themselves as fighting for a sort of common good above the fray version of American politics, and getting beyond partisan divisions that echoed, the appeal of someone like Jimmy Carter in the 20th century, or even Barack Obama. And a big part of his 2008 upstart insurgent presidential campaign was being above, moving beyond partisan divisions. There's not a red America. There's not a blue America. There's the United States of America. I think he said that in a famous speech, right? So that has echoes, that borrows in many ways from the populist movement of the late 19th century. So just wanted to point that out. Okay, moving on. So this, let's see, and actually, let's not talk about that right now, because that doesn't relate to the populist movement. But I did want to talk about this, Kansas populists. So this is pictured here are a group of Kansas populists. probably on their way to a political gathering of like-minded populists in a photograph from the 1890s. This picture depicts, it's actually the cover of a campaign book, excuse me, depicting Tom Watson, the Georgia populist leader. And this is a campaign book from 1892. It says, "Not a revolt, it is a revolution," the People's Party campaign book. Okay, let's talk about how they built their movement, their platform, their coalition, the limits of their coalition. Excuse me. So the populists adopted a famous platform at their 1892 Omaha convention. So the platform proposed, excuse me, many different measures to restore democracy and economic opportunity for ordinary Americans. Some of which, most of these didn't come to fruition initially, but many of them came to pass, came to be implemented in some way, shape, or form in the early to mid 19th century, in the Progressive era and in the New Deal era that we'll cover next in this class. So, for example, the direct election of U.S. senators, which is associated with the Progressive era, that got its start in the populist platform of 1892. A graduated income tax, a low-cost public financing for farmers, workers' rights to organize unions as well. The idea of nationalizing the railroads. National ownership, government control, essentially, tight government supervision over the railroads to allow farmers to inexpensively get their crops to market. That was another aspect of their 1892 political party platform that made its way into 20th century reform movements. In some parts of the South, the populists heroically tried to unite Black and white farmers on a common political and economic program, but the barriers were too great. Racism, along with the legacy of the Civil War, the fact that many white populists were landowning farmers, while Black farmers were tenants and agricultural laborers, sharecroppers, than were landowners, although some Blacks were certainly landowners as well. So these differences between whites and Blacks, not just racial differences, but just kind of demographic, just differences in terms of being landowners and being land tenants, made the divisions too great. And the two groups faced a different set of problems, which all militated against such an alliance between Blacks and whites within the context of the populist movement of the late 19th century. Let's see, Black farmers organized their own farmers alliance, whose strikes were suppressed by white authorities, unfortunately. Some of whom were even sympathetic to white populists. Some white populists were hardly white populists, I should say, were hardly anti-racist. At the same time, some of these populists recognized that whites would have to appeal to Blacks in order to break the Democratic Party's hold on the South in its opposition to reform. And actually, in a few places, most famously in North Carolina, white and Black populists together won state elections. In most of the South, however, Democrats defeated the populists by mobilizing whites to vote against, quote, Negro supremacy, by intimidating Blacks and by rigging elections. Essentially, the movement towards Jim Crow laws, the Jim Crow segregationist playbook, and anti-Black playbook in the South of the late 19th century, that influences the ability of the populist movement to cross racial lines, which ultimately affected populism staying power. Okay, so the populists also engaged the reform efforts of farmers and middle-class women, and endorsed women's suffrage in many states in 1890. In 1892, the populist candidate for president, James Weaver, won more than 1 million votes, and the party carried 5 Western states and elected 3 governors and 15 members of Congress. Okay, so this is a political cartoon from 1891, showing Northern and Southern Civil War veterans clasping hands across the quote, bloody chasm, a phrase first used by New York editor Horace Greeley during his campaign for president in 1872. Beneath each figure is an explanation of why voting alignments have previously been based on sectionalism. The North fears rebel rule, and the South fears, of course, Negro supremacy. So the idea here is, the creator of this political cartoon, obviously is trying to put forth the idea of black and white, North and South coming together across the chasm of the Civil War. What's I going to say? Yeah, so North and South coming together across, getting beyond the divide of the Civil War, coming together in kind of a glorious unionism. And this is something that tended to, trying to think of how to explain this just quickly. This is something that tended to necessarily involve erasing the memory of the Civil War as an emancipationist undertaking, right? So there's an aspect of the Civil War that was, sort of the Frederick Douglass vision of Civil War memory, which saw the Civil War as a second American Revolution and emancipationist underpinning. So in a fight to bring blacks into full citizenship, full members of the American body politic, and North and South coming together across the bloody chasm implies forgetting, not that that was always bad, and not that that wasn't necessary to a certain extent, but to a certain extent that implies forgetting that the Civil War was about Black equality and Black inclusion in the body politic, right? And so to the extent that North and South are coming together in this sort of white brotherhood version of historical memory, they're probably forgetting about the Black inclusion aspect of Civil War memory, and thus they're probably not interested in including Blacks in their populist platform, in the populist movement as well. Okay, so this kind of illustrates the strength of the populist movement, and specifically the areas where the populists were strong and they weren't as strong. So in 1892, you could see the states in red, that kind of sharp red are the states where they got almost 50% of the vote or more. And that's Alabama and the Deep South, and then a lot of, Western states. So North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, all the way to Nevada. And you can see they got a pretty solid reservoir of support in the South, in states like North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana. So that's kind of the idea. And you can see they don't have a whole lot of support in the Midwest and the Northeast. So and actually I'll talk more about that soon. Populism and women's suffrage. So it's interesting. Most populists in the West actually supported women's suffrage, and this cartoon is sort of indicative of that. So in this cartoon, it was published in the Colorado Populist newspaper, in 1894. This depicts a man and a woman celebrating the passage of a referendum giving women the right to vote in that state. So women's suffrage really took off in the West before it took off in the East, interestingly. And so the first states where women could vote before women could vote nationally after the passage of the Women's Suffrage Amendment in the early 20th century, the first states where women could vote actually were in the West. I think the first state to grant women the vote, I believe, was Wyoming, if I'm not mistaken. It's surprising to a lot of people, but and the idea was they wanted women to move to the West. There was a more early on in sort of the frontier days, there were a disproportionate number of men compared to women in Western in the Western territories and the early Western states. So the populists, it's kind of a reflection of the fact that populism was a Western movement, right? So populists, in keeping with the fact that the populist movement sprang from the political milieu of the West, in Western agrarian sort of society and politics and culture, it makes sense that they supported, for the most part, women's suffrage. Okay, let's talk about how the government responded to the populists. I'm also going to get into what's happening with labor. Labor, in this case, referring to industrial labor, in factories, but also in among miners and steel workers and that kind of thing. And so I want to kind of take a snapshot of what's happening with labor in the 1880s and 1890s and how that relates to populism. And populist efforts in the 1890s, especially to recruit industrial workers into their coalition, which could have meant theoretically a majority coalition, which would have given the populist staying power. Okay, so when a severe depression in 1893 intensified conflict between labor and capital, it seemed that the populists might gain the votes of industrial workers who had traditionally supported the two major parties. Employers used state or federal authority to protect their economic power and suppress labor unrest. In May 1894, the federal government dispersed what was called Coxey's Army, a march of the unemployed led by Jacob Coxey, an Ohio businessman, that converged on the nation's capital. So that's a little snapshot of kind of what's going on. Also in 1894, workers in the company-owned town of Pullman, Illinois, called for a strike to protest a reduction in wages. The American Railway Union, with some 150,000 members, announced they would not handle Pullman cars. And this boycott quickly crippled National Rail Service. And through President Grover Cleveland, an injunction was obtained that ordered the strikers back to work. The strike collapsed after the union's leaders, including Eugene Debs, famous socialist union activist and politician, these union leaders were actually jailed. The Supreme Court later confirmed their sentences and approved the use of injunctions against striking labor unions. So a lot more strife happening here in the 1890s between labor and capital. The dissolution of a group that we talked about in the last video, the Knights of Labor, who had their heyday, their apex was sort of the 1880s, and specifically the year 1886. So the dissolution of the Knights of Labor and the rise of the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, in the 1890s signaled in the labor movement a move away from broad reforms to more limited aims. So strikes like the Pullman strike seem to show that direct confrontations with capital devastated workers' organizations. So this Pullman strike you could see as sort of a tipping point, a turning point, right? Direct confrontations, bloody, violent strikes, boycotts, confrontations with management and with capital made things worse, not better. And so the AFL actually, the American Federation of Labor under Samuel Gompers, puts in place sort of a business-friendly unionism. And it's a more practical unionism, right? It's not averse to strikes of all kind, not opposed to striking under any circumstances, but really it's interested in kind of working hand in hand with capital to improve working conditions and wages and that kind of thing, as opposed to trying to implement more utopian visions, right, of kind of worker-controlled cooperatives replacing capitalist corporations and capitalist-led industrialization. So a little bit more about this. Let's see. Unions declared Samuel Gompers, the AFL's founder and longtime president, should avoid seeking economic independence, politics, or the utopian goals of groups like the Knights. Gompers and the AFL thought unions should simply bargain with employers for higher wages and better working conditions. This is a vision that's similar to like a Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington's vision for Black economic mobility, right? So similarly, Gompers used the era's business culture, and his strategy, again, was known as basically business unionism. Similarly, he embraced the idea that we talked about in the last video of freedom of contract, right? But he sought to put his own spin on this idea of freedom of contract. He turned it into an argument against the interference of judges with workers' rights to organize unions. So capitalists would argue in favor of freedom of contract, in that, in the sense that, it was the idea that workers and unions and government ought not interfere with the decisions of business and management to run their business as they saw fit. That was counterproductive. That was their vision of freedom of contract, right? And just freedom more generally. The vision of freedom by someone like Samuel Gompers was that, well, actually, capital, has freedom to govern their affairs as they see fit. But at the same time, workers have freedom to organize unions and to go on strike if they want to go on strike, and to drive a hard bargain for better wages. That's a part of freedom. And to restrict those rights, to restrict unionism, is to restrict freedom itself, and is anti-American, right? That was essentially his argument. Okay, so in the 1890s, as a result of this, union membership actually recovered from its decline in the late 1880s. But it was a different kind of union membership. So the AFL actually abandoned the Knights' ideal of labor solidarity and restricted its membership to skilled workers, a small minority which effectively excluded most Blacks, most women, and most new European immigrants. So the AFL basically becomes strong in skilled trades, like among highly skilled workers, like printing, like construction, and was weak or non-existent in basic industries that employed a lot of unskilled or semi-skilled workers, like the steel industry, the coal industry, coal miners, that kind of thing. In 1894, the Populists doubled their efforts to appeal to these industrial workers, and this could have been the big turning point in the Populist movement. 1894 was an off year, so it's congressional elections, midterm elections, not presidential elections. That wouldn't happen until 1896, which we'll talk about that election in a second. The Populists thought they had an opportunity here. Sorry, it's getting a little sunny. There we go. So the Populists thought they had an opportunity here to expand their coalition into, industrial workers in the Midwest and Northeast. And they thought with the Depression worsening and hopefully the voters abandoning the Democratic Party, the Populists thought they had an opening, right? And unfortunately didn't work out that way. Now, the populist vote increased in rural areas during this time, but most industrial workers ultimately did not vote populist. Few populist demands, the reason for this is that, first of all, few populist demands actually spoke to the needs of workers. So if you think about it, the populist calls for higher agricultural prices through changes in monetary policy and changes in railroad policy and other changes. Ultimately, that would raise food costs for workers, right? So these workers weren't farmers. Their relationship to farms in the West was mostly food, right? And if they had to pay higher prices for food, was that serving their interests? Well, in that sense, probably not, right? So yeah, again, few populist demands spoke to workers' needs. Higher agricultural prices would raise the food costs of these workers and diminish the value of their wages, kind of by extension. The movement's Protestant and revivalist culture, represented by their standard bearer in 1896, which I'll talk about in a second, William Jennings Bryan, alienated the workers of the Northeast and the Midwest, many of whom were new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and as a result were Catholic. And this heavily Protestant revivalist culture, which drew upon like the Second Great Awakening, which was a highly Protestant movement, that was alienating. That didn't really speak to Catholic immigrant workers, and so that played into the populist inability to expand their coalition. Urban workers instead voted for overwhelmingly for the Republicans, who argued that higher tariffs would revive the economy by protecting American manufacturing and workers from imports and cheap foreign labor. All in all, the Republicans gained a massive 117 seats in the House in the 1894 election. Pretty amazing to think about. So that's a picture of Coxey's army in 1894. This depicts federal troops during the Pullman strike. So here, federal troops pose atop a railroad engine after being sent to Chicago to suppress the Pullman strike of 1894. Okay, let's talk about labor and silver and William Jennings Bryan, monetary policy, and how that relates to the populace, and also the campaign of 1896, which was similar to what happened in 1896 was similar to what happened, what I just talked about happening in 1894. So in 1896, the Democrats and populists united actually behind William Jennings Bryan, who was a young congressman from Nebraska. Bryan had won the Democratic nomination in a speech that captured the hopes and the fears of farmers. So Bryan called for the, quote, free coinage of silver, which means basically the unrestricted minting of silver money. And he used biblical imagery to condemn the gold standard in perhaps the most famous lines of political oratory in American history. So Bryan said, quote, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor with this crown of thorns. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, end quote. So Bryan's demand for free silver was the latest expression of a longstanding view that increasing the amount of currency in circulation would raise the prices of farmers' crops and make it easier for them to pay their debts. Let's kind of talk about this for a second. Yeah, so this is a long-standing, basically, there's a history of this argument, of this point of view in American politics and American society, especially in the 19th century, going all the way back to the days of Andrew Jackson. And the populists sort of picked up on this, and specifically, they wanted to increase the idea is they wanted to increase the money supply. The money supplies they saw was unnecessarily wedded to the gold standard, which was unnecessarily restrictive and favored Eastern financial elite interest over Western agrarian interest, right? They wanted to expand the money supply, and the way to do that was the free coinage of silver. So it's kind of this wonky argument that it's funny to think about. The money supply is like getting people worked up. It's like, do people even know anything about monetary supply and currency? But actually, a lot of people cared about this and were quite passionate about it, especially in the ranks of the populace. So, Bryan's nomination represented a shift in Democratic leadership away from elites. But Bryan's appeal was highly religious and revivalist and influenced by the social gospel, which we talked about in the last video, if I'm not mistaken. So Republicans, on the other hand, argued that gold was the only, quote, honest currency, and that abandoning it would prevent economic recovery by scaring creditors away from making loans. So they made the argument that it would actually hurt the economy overall, including Western farmers, rather than alleviate economic burdens. The Republicans ended up nominating Governor William McKinley of Ohio, who had shepherded the highly protectionist McKinley Tariff in Congress in 1890. The 1896 election was the first modern, could be seen basically as the first modern presidential election. So the Republicans put in basically an unprecedented amount of money into a highly organized campaign that used a massive educational effort directed against the Democrats' calls for free silver. The results showed a nation divided along regional rather than class lines. McKinley won the election with the votes, the overwhelming support and votes of industrial states in the Northeast and Midwest. In the Northeast and Midwest. So labor conflict did ultimately not produce political results. Party politics seemed to mute class conflict, not reinforce it. Industrial America from workers to industrialists, voted ultimately solidly Republican and continued to do so for years. McKinley's victory ultimately shattered the political stalemate of the previous 20 years and put in place a period was the impetus for a period of Republican dominance over American politics that would last really up until FDR in the 1930s and the response to the Great Depression. And also marked, interestingly, a pinnacle in voter participation, which ever since has been in decline. So a lot of interest in politics during this time and an expansion of voter resurgence, right, of a surge in voter participation. Okay. So yeah, so this is entitled Cross of Gold. So this is a cartoon from the magazine Judge from 1896, and this is a condemnation, basically, of William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech for defiling the symbols of Christianity. Bryan tramples in the Bible while holding his golden cross, and a vandalized church is visible in the background. Combating the money power. So this is another populist cartoon, this one from a Colorado newspaper. And here you can see the figure of liberty kind of in the middle of the two men, directing a member of the producing classes on the right to use the ballot box to combat the money power on the left. So that's from the Rocky Mountain News. And this is this is a map of the presidential election, the electoral distribution of the electoral votes of the basically who won each state in the presidential election of 1896. So you can see the stark regional contrast here. So the Northeast, right here, the Northeast and Midwest, overwhelmingly, voted for McKinley, the Republican, and the South and the Midwest. The South, the Great Plains, and the West and Texas, overwhelmingly, really with the exception of most of California and Oregon, overwhelmingly voted for William Jennings Bryan. The fusion ticket, which was in part a populist party, People's Party, platform and ticket. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is the populist continuities and discontinuities with previous American reform movements. And so, in kind of our final analysis, how do the populists fit in with previous American reform movements, especially in the 19th century, the tradition of American reform, and how are they different? How do they diverge from it, right? So to talk about this, or any discussion of this is kind of premised on the notion of talking about classical republicanism and its influence on the American Revolution and kind of the early 19th century, the reform tradition in the antebellum era, the pre-Civil War era, and even before that. So an important ideological component of the American Revolution was this idea of classical republicanism, or just basically republicanism. Let's just call it republicanism. And by the way, when I say republicanism in this context, I don't mean the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln and we just talked about William Howard Taft being the Republican candidate. McKinley being the Republican candidate in 1896, and Donald Trump is a Republican and that kind of thing. So this means something different. It's republicanism. This sort of worldview or ideology was highly, and by the way, this ideology in many ways is derived from understandings of classical writings, the classical sort of intellectual tradition of Greece and Rome. And also it's associated with the Florentine Renaissance beginning in like the 15th century. I could say a lot more about that, but it's not really necessary for our purposes. So this makes its way to the American colonies and influences the American Revolution, this idea of republicanism. And Republicans basically believed republicanism basically was a worldview that stressed local self-determination, advocated for liberty in the public sphere, while not necessarily in the private sphere. And most of all, I think here's what's most important to keep in mind. Republicanism placed citizen virtue as the protector of liberty from government corruption. So Republicans, adherents of the sort of Republicanist tradition, saw the potential for state government, government corruption kind of everywhere, and were extremely sensitive to people and groups using government, using state power to erode liberty for common people. And they were also interested in, I'll talk more about this, are highly sensitive to how you maintain a virtuous citizenry. So you can only maintain a healthy, balanced, stable society by maintaining a virtuous citizenry. And this virtuous citizenry was hard to maintain. Many advocates of Republican ideology insisted, and oftentimes they would insist that, and this is a view associated with Thomas Jefferson, for example, that, having a nation of like small farmers, or what he called yeoman farmers, right? Small landowners was a way of keeping the citizens virtuous, as opposed to pursuing a sort of English or European style mode of economic development that emphasized industrialization, where people would move to the cities and become workers. Men like Thomas Jefferson and other adherents of Republican ideology believed that was people moving to, the development of industrialization and crowding into cities invariably led to the decline of virtue and vice and degeneracy, and made men dependent as opposed to being independent. And you had to be autonomous and independent to be a virtuous citizen and participant in American society. So anyway, that idea strongly influenced the American Revolution. And that's something I talk a lot about within the context of my U.S. History to 1865 class. But just wanted to cover that here because that relates to what we're gonna talk about. So I would say, so the agrarian populace, at the vanguard of the reform efforts in the late 19th century, they borrowed in many ways from the political rhetoric of the American Revolution, and also the Jeffersonians and Jacksonians of the antebellum era. So the major reform movements of the pre-Civil War era. So first of all, you have in both cases a stark juxtaposition between producers, quote unquote producers, responsible for wealth creation, and non-producers, financial elites who manipulated government to steal the fruits of other men's labors. And another iteration of this is kind of the distinction between the people and the interests. So the populace of the late 19th century rooted their appeal in this kind of rhetoric, right? The people versus the interests, the producers versus the non-producers, right? And of course, they were the people and they were the producers. They were the embodiment, the representatives of the people and the producers. So that's something that you see in Jacksonian political rhetoric. In the 1820s and 1830s, you see it in the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, in his sort of compatriots, his ideological brothers, right? Similarly, late 19th century populist opposition to, quote, ruthless corporations and trusts, opposition to concentrations of wealth and market power. They mirrored Jeffersonian's Republican notion that concentrations of wealth invariably led to corruption and made men unfit for Republican citizenship. And the agrarian myth of Jefferson, that supposedly blinded Hofstadter's populists to the potential benefits of the modern political economy. This is an argument Hofstadter makes about the populists. He says basically, they want to go back to a nation of small farmers that was sort of pre-industrial and pre-capitalist, and it's this sort of pastoral vision of American society. And he basically says that not only is that not happening, and that's, That's not happening now, but also that was never the case. America was never really America was a farming society, but the farming was oriented early on towards the market and not towards subsistence. And this sort of pastoral tradition is false nostalgia, right? So anyway, this agrarian myth that perhaps you could say the populists, or at least Hofstadter would say the populists were invested in, harkened back in some ways to the mythical yeoman farmer, the prototypical virtuous citizen of Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, an embodiment of popular sovereignty. However, I think there's last thing I was going to mention here, there's important differences between the late 19th century agrarian populists and other reform movements in American history, at least up to that time. So the populist political vision, I think, differed most starkly from that of the Jeffersonians and Jacksonians in its notion of the role of the state, right? And its notion of the role the state had played in bringing about the significant obstacles of the late 19th century, and also the role the state should play in alleviating the burdens of, for example, high interest rate loans and unemployment and economic depressions and that kind of thing. So populists responded to the unique circumstances of an industrial capitalist system, investing individuals and economic organizations, the private sector, with such extraordinary power that they had grown beyond the policing capacity of the American state. So it's a different situation in the late 19th century because the American state had become American industrial capitalism in the United States had become such a force, so powerful, and individual corporations, right, along with individual people at the helms of these corporations, industrial capitalists themselves, had become so powerful that many people felt, and certainly this is a common theme in populist rhetoric and writings and ideology, many people felt that they had grown beyond the capacity of the American state to the regulatory capacity of the American state. So basically, the American state wasn't big enough and nimble enough and well put together enough. The main thing was that it wasn't big enough to handle this new situation of industrial capitalism, right? And so that's the main difference, right? So earlier in America's history, in the antebellum period, for example, the U.S. was essentially a developing country. Thus, those who argued in favor of expanded state power claimed that this was a prerequisite of economic development, right? So people wanted state power to promote capitalism, to promote market development. Usually that's why they argued in favor of the state. And furthermore, abuses of power were usually associated with the state. The less powerful attacked allegedly the more powerful, wealthy financiers and speculators, for example, for using the state to serve their own narrow interests instead of the common good. Rights and liberties were soon to be under threat from the state in the form of collusion, basically financial elites working hand in hand, working together with political elites to corrupt politics, to give themselves a disproportionate share of economic and political and social and cultural power, right, over regular people. And that was in keeping with the tradition of republicanism, classical republicanism. So the idea, again, was threats come from the state. Liberty is eroded as a result of the state. But what was happening in the late 19th century was liberty was being eroded. Many people thought, including the populists, not from the state, but from people and organizations outside of the state. And really it was anything and everybody associated with industrial capitalism. It had grown too powerful. And therefore the state had to be expanded. And that's the main difference between, again, the populists and earlier reform efforts. The populists were arguing, really for the first time in American history, in a meaningful way, for massive state expansion over the economy. So yeah, let's see. Yeah. So in the late 19th century, many people blame society's problems not on an overgrown state, but on a rampage in capitalism, and reason that state power had to be expanded to level the playing field and bring order and fairness to this new dynamic society. Just to kind of bring home what I just talked about. Okay, so that is it for my discussion of populism. Thanks for watching and listening, and I'll see you for the next video.